Dr. Bob Hamilton. I'm the president of Delphi Global Research Center, and welcome to our event on how Ukraine turned how the U.S. $50 billion ERA loan was turned into Ukraine's financial bedrock. This is based on a longer 60-page report produced by two of our scholars, Maximilian Hess and Jack Lambert-Stosser, who are both online with us. Delphi Global Research Center is a U.S.-based, Eurasia-focused nonprofit think tank. We aim to be a hub for Eurasia-based and focused scholars, and we aim to produce relevant, actionable research on the major political, economic, and security issues in Eurasia. Our hope is to be a transmission belt between the scholarly world and the policy world, bringing the insights from the former, from the scholarly world, into the policy world to translate into actionable policy recommendations. And I think this report is a great example of how we hope to do that. I think Max and Jack have managed to take something that many people are interested in, but very few people understand, and produce a report. And we hope this is an event that is interesting and informative for an expert audience, but is also accessible and understandable for a more general audience. So with that said, I'll turn it over. I'm not gonna moderate. Our Vice President Maya Otarashvili will, and the main reason for that is I'm currently in Ukraine. My internet connection is not super stable, and there's always the chance that I may have to drop off with little warning. So let me turn it over to you, Maya, and we'll get started. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Bob. So I just put the link to the actual report in the chat box so everyone can access it. You can go on our website, read the report. You can also download it as a flip book or as a PDF file. And we're very grateful to have Max and Jack with us today. I believe Max is in the UK and Jack is in France. And I think we have quite a few guests who are in Europe right now. So I thank all of you for joining us. So let's just go ahead. Jack is sharing his screen so we can have a PowerPoint presentation. And after the initial remarks, please use the Q&A feature to send in your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Just a quick reminder, we are recording this event and it will go up on our YouTube channel. So you can view it later on if you need to, or share it with friends and colleagues. All right, thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you guys.
Great. I'm going to kick off before handing off to Jack. But once again, my thanks to all the attendees and to Delphi, Maya, and Bob for supporting this research. I'm going to start off from first principles before we get into things in depth, just for the benefit of all attendees in case anybody isn't familiar. What I want to say from the get-go is that this is the largest sovereign-to-sovereign single loans program that has been agreed since the Second World War. It is the bedrock of Ukraine's financing today, as the core instrument that was agreed throughout the course of 2024 and then largely dispersed already in 2025, providing Kyiv with the financing that it needs together with its support from Western allies. Obviously, direct financial support from the United States has fallen significantly, almost entirely, since January of last year. The fundamental pile of assets that we're talking about in the structure and the precedent that it set are therefore not only crucially important to understanding how Ukraine has continued to be funded since the change in administrations in the United States, but also, as we'll get to a little bit at the end, and is the focus of our additional research that will follow up from this paper, is it is similar structures and a similar set of assets that will sit at the core of questions of potential future Ukrainian funding. So you may be aware that there were discussions amongst the European Union in December of last year for the next large funding package for Ukraine, one that could be as large as $90 billion, that would again seek to harness the fundamental underlying pot of assets that are used here. Would be a differentiated structure, but this sets the important precedents, the baseline, and as something that has already been agreed, is at least entirely dispersed in terms of the funds having been delivered to the underlying mechanisms, and therefore we can go and say what lessons have been learned from it and what are the implications for potential future funding. of Ukraine. But to return to those first principles I mentioned, what I think is important for everybody to understand here is that this is a loan to Ukraine, but one that is structured to very much minimize the potential that Kiev itself will have to pay back the loan. And the way that that is done fundamentally is by harnessing Russia's frozen assets. So the first question I want to answer is, what are those frozen assets and why are they there to be harnessed in the first place, and what are they? So Russia had just over $300 billion in sovereign assets that sat around the world at the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022. These are funds that are held in the name of the Russian government, held in the name of the Russian National Wealth Fund, the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and other direct sovereign assets. We are not talking about assets connected to other Russian sub-sovereign entities, Gazprom, Gazpromneft, Rosneft, et cetera, et cetera. Sovereign assets have a particularly important position in international law, which is that they typically benefit from what is called sovereign immunity, that they cannot, that there are restrictions on how they can be used, how other governments can affect them. The simplest way to think about this is the normal way it is discussed, which is around the principle of a country's embassy in another city. So here, speaking to you from London, we of course have a Russian embassy that remains very active, not too far away from the Ukrainian embassy. Actually going and shutting down those embassies with sanctions and the like is something that international law has typically held that there are real limitations on. But there have been decades of sanctioning in terms of freezing sovereign assets. This is obviously a very important question with relation to Iran today, but also goes back to assets held from Cuba and other countries that have been the targets of international sanctions programs in the past. Russia had undertaken a lot of actions and changes to its own sovereign asset strategy and sovereign borrowing strategy to fund some of these assets over the years, which has been the subject of my previous work, often coordinated with Maya and Bob over the years. But the real pile of assets, the single largest one of that 300 billion plus, is what sits at the core of our question here, the core of this structure, and is the 230 billion plus US dollars worth of Russian assets that are nominally held at a European institution called Euroclear. Euroclear is not a bank. It is not an institution that you, whether as an individual investor or even as a sophisticated financial markets player, are likely to interact with yourself. What it is it is a clearinghouse. It comes from the previous legacy structures of sovereign finance where you have an asset that effectively, you have an institution that effectively sits there and once upon a time would have held the literal paper stocks and the paper bonds that had coupons on them, and they were clipped to then mark that payments would be owed. And originally Euroclear would have taken those coupons and said this much is owed to this institution, this much is owed to that one. So it's not a financial institution in terms of a bank itself. It is the house, the clearinghouse where all of these assets are counted. That means that whether the Russian sovereign held euro assets or dollar assets, whether they have been a corporate bond or whether they have been a U.S. Treasury or British gilt at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, sure, they might have purchased those through their counterparties at A bank or B private bank or even a Russian bank, but that ultimately the actual custodianship of the paper, the place that sort of said, how much belongs to whom, was Euroclear. So more than 230 billion US dollars of Russian frozen assets, as I mentioned, are stuck at Euroclear and have been immobilized by the sanctions that were placed on the Russian sovereign and the Russian central bank since 2022. These assets are therefore under both European and Belgian jurisdiction. And Euroclear is a very important institution for a lot of wider points of the economic war that exists between Russia, Ukraine, and its Western allies, because other frozen assets are parked there as well. What it is important to remember, when an asset is frozen, one loses the automatic right to the title of the interest that is earned on it. So that fundamental $230 billion still belongs to Russia in both international Belgian as well as European Union law. But the potential investment income from those frozen assets does not belong to Russia. So you can see this, for example, here in London, where in the city of London, there is still a building that belongs to the Central Bank of Iran. It has sat empty for many years. They do not have the right to lease that building out. It sits there effectively frozen. When you have money in a bank rather than in a real estate asset, that bank is obviously marking that as a deposit, and interest is typically paid on it. The fundamental idea behind this loan, the so-called ERA loans to Ukraine, what is known as the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Program, is meant to say, how can we take the interest earned off of those frozen Russian assets and ensure that they are used to help fund Ukraine's defense against the full-scale invasion by the Kremlin. So that fundamentally, the ERA loan that we are discussing is a structure to take that interest and move it to the benefit of Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, it had actually been Euroclear itself that had earned record profits because they were entitled to keep the interest that came from those assets. So now, rather than being an institution based in Belgium, where Belgium did initially increase the taxes paid by Euroclear to try to use that money to fund its own support for Ukraine, this has now become a multilateral instrument and a multilateral framework. The last point I want to just mention on this slide quickly is that it is not a single instrument, but it is a framework with a multi-revenue stream where the countries themselves that are supporting this, the G7 countries of the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Japan, and together with the European Union, have themselves agreed to give that $50 billion in immediate funding, and then they will be repaid that $50 billion off of the back of the interest that is earned on these frozen assets. So since last year, Ukraine has already had that $50 billion fully available to it. This structure is to ensure that those countries that advance that money to Ukraine are repaid from the benefit of the earnings on those frozen Russian assets. Fundamentally, Jack, I think you can go on to the next slide here. The way that this works is different between each of those member countries, as you can see on the left-hand side of this diagram, but it is overseen by something called the Ukraine Loan Cooperation Mechanism. And the Ukraine Loan Cooperation Mechanism is the financial architecture that sits at the heart of the ERA to ensure that repayments flow from one way, from these frozen assets to the other. The common term used for this is windfall profits earned from the frozen assets. I would quibble a little bit with that term because this kind of interest is normal and ordinary. But the loans flow through three streams. The EU, which puts its assets directly through the ULCM. Then the UK, which has allowed its lending to go directly bilaterally to Ukraine. And the US, Canada, and Japan, which have used their portion of the $50 billion to fund a program backed by the World Bank called the Facilitation of Resources to Invest in the Strengthening of Ukraine, and which is what's called a financial intermediary fund in line with World Bank structure. There's ample precedent for so-called financial intermediary funds, or FIFs, to be used by the World Bank to support countries in times of sovereign distress. This is a adapting of that framework to ensure that there is a governance oversight of how these funds are distributed. It does not mean that the World Bank itself is either a guarantor of the loan or that it is on otherwise the hook for repayment thereof. So the last part that I want to talk about in my slides before I hand over to Jack, which we can turn to the next slide for, is how are these frozen assets used? What is sort of done with them? And the simplest way to understand this is that we are obviously now more than 4 years into the full-scale invasion. These assets were invested in a large number of securities at the beginning of the war, the vast majority of which, based on what we know from Russian sovereign wealth fund holdings, will have matured over those few years. There may be some that haven't. The Euroclear itself has not publicly detailed the exact makeup of all of Russian holdings there, but from the average life maturity reported by the Russian National Wealth Fund and Central Bank of its own holdings pre-2022, which would have included these assets, we can assume that more than 90 or even 95% of them have matured. What that means is that they are then cash plus the interest that was already previously paid on them. So that 230 billion has even grown over that time because interest was paid on it, taken primarily by Euroclear initially, and then now sits there to further increase the total size of the funds that sit in the Ukraine loan cooperation mechanism and can ensure repayment of these loans. They are then invested in the safest possible government securities under the regulatory framework of the European Union and Belgium. That means that those securities will pay in line with the baseline European interest rate, over 3% per annum off the back of that. Means that there are more than ample funds sitting there with that, just the 230 million in initial principal to repay this loan, right? It is more than $8 billion a year in interest payments at that minimum rate that comes there. What exactly the structure is of those, how long dated they are, and the future interest of them as interest rates change potentially in Europe is material to the potential speed at which those other sovereign lenders to Ukraine that have advanced this money for it are able to themselves be repaid. But fundamentally, so long as Russian assets remain frozen, they will not bear any financial risk. And fundamentally, so long as those Russian assets remain frozen and the Ukraine loan cooperation mechanism remains in place, means that Kyiv will also not bear any repayment risk in which it potentially has to repay part of this loan itself. The only circumstances in which that could change, one, which Russia has argued, is that it could bring an arbitration case against this. We will talk more about this later on in the questioning, but in our view is relatively unlikely. And the second is that were there to be a collapse entirely of the European Union's own sanctions framework and they were to remove these structures from European Union law. So that's not the normal 6-month redesignation of Russian individuals and companies targeted to the war that the European Union does, which creates a lot of plumbing issues in the sanctions framework on that and the potential for holdout risk from Hungary and other countries. This is even more secured in the European sanctions framework. So therefore, we think it's pretty fair to say that these Russian assets are not only being used in a good way, because otherwise the profits would just be going to Euroclear and to the Belgian tax structure on it, but two, that they have enabled the advance loan of this funding to Ukraine, this $50 billion that came at such a crucial moment last year, the vast majority of which has been dispersed to Kyiv, and where the potential that Kyiv itself will be left on the hook for repaying these either due to Russian warfare or European changes in sanctions policy is kept minimum. And so with that, I'll hand over to Jack for the second half of our presentation and look forward to any of your questions later on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Max, for the first part of the presentation. I want to say thank you again to Delphi. Thank you, Maya and Robert, for your support so far. It's been really nice working with you. So yeah, as Max outlaid essentially the context of what is happening, right? Like this unprecedented situation. The remainder of the presentation, I'm just basically going to cover two things, right? Who sent what and when. This is going to be a very quick section, sort of building a little bit, just detailing what Max was discussing about the Fortis FIF and the ULCM. And then the second and last element of it is going to be covering the ULCM, why it's idiosyncratic, it's novel in nature, but then also the elements of the legislation which bring up hypothetical scenarios, which, as Max already has said, essentially, like there's a very low likelihood that Ukraine gets left, quote unquote, holding the bag. But what eventually we find is that essentially the European Union did a ton of work to really make this into a concrete and airtight sort of structure. So essentially, in terms of who sent what and when, the United States, Canada, and Japan all use this World Bank structure, which is sitting atop the stream. Essentially, it's an off-balance sheet vehicle by the World Bank, and they're using this and they're dispersing it to Ukraine. The UK, as Max said, is sending via their own channels, and the EU via the ULCM. And we found, based on the publicly available information from the G7 statements and also Ministry of Finance statements, here's some information that we understand is available and accurate regarding the actual dispersals. So one thing I would like to emphasize as well is that disbursement is that these funds have been put to use, not necessarily that they've been dispersed to Ukraine. So we see the United States sent 20 billion to Fortis in December 2024. 15.7 billion of that has been dispersed. The European Union has sent all of its money already. The UK will be topping up this year. Same with Japan, and Canada has sent all of its money already. The rates on these loans are very, very low, and the maturities as well are quite generous. So we see the European Union, this is representative of its overall political support of Ukraine, is that they're extending the maturity to up to 45 years. So that is a very important element of the situation for Ukraine. Some other details, right? The World Bank financing vehicle, it does not allow the use of these funds for military means. The UK dispersal, however, does, and the EU sends money via the ULCM, and then Ukraine decides what they do with it. So essentially this, as I said, this is what we have found so far on the actual loans themselves. And now I will get into the Ukraine loan cooperation mechanism. So it's best understood as essentially, an intermediary space. I like to visualize it as sort of a basket that the European Union and Ukraine share, and the European Union puts the money in, and then Ukraine gets to do whatever it will with it. In the prior chart, we had those two lines that were connecting Ukraine to the ULCM to the EU. That is essentially just to demonstrate that this is a mechanism which functions because they signed a treaty that was based on the actual legislation of the ULCM. They signed a treaty that allows Ukraine to get the funds via the ULCM. So again, it is idiosyncratic, like I mentioned, and in a large part because a lot of its usefulness really depends on actually the Russian funds remaining frozen. But there are also, like Max said, there are very, very stringent reasons why these funds will likely remain frozen for the time being, specifically regarding the manner of the triggering of Article 122 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. It also has a repayment waterfall, which is very strict, and it also details, again, if in the worst case scenario, Ukraine ends up paying, how that might come to be. So the first thing that I would say that I really think is important to take home about the ULCM and Article 122 in regards to the ULCM and the frozen assets is that in the legislation where they decided to indefinitely immobilize the assets, essentially they say that the conditions for unfreezing the assets are three, right? The first one being that the war is over. The second one being that reparations are paid by the Russian Federation, which it has said that it won't do. And the third being that, and I'm going to quote the legislation directly here, that the actions of the Russian Federation no longer, quote, they no longer, quote, pose a serious risk of severe difficulties to the economy of the Union and its member states, which is quite a broad brush. And that's all to just sort of unfreeze the assets. And so this is all laid out in the regulation 2024-2773. And then in the report, we also lay out the legislation that we just cited about those three Article 122 conditions. So here is a diagram that we put together based on the payment waterfall, which I'm about to describe, but also there are hypothetical elements that come into play here. Because again, we're talking about a moving target, we're talking about things that are going on currently, and the political situation may change, but it's very strict in the legislation. The payment waterfall is first, if A is insufficient to service the loans, then B kicks in, and so on and so forth. So A is the windfall profits that Max was describing, how and why they're used, how they're separate from the actual underlying principle. And so if those windfall profits are good to service these loans, then everything is fine. B is pocketed with A as well, because it has to do with excess funds of those windfall profits. And so essentially, if the cup runneth over, so to speak, then anything in addition is going to be used to proportionally pay back, to service the loans to the G7 lenders. So that first level of the waterfall there, that is sort of within the bounds of current reality. As Max laid out, we have very good returns on the principal, et cetera, et cetera. Then if we come to point C, which is, are Russian war reparations sufficient? So again, if Russia has said that they're not going to pay reparations, and this is when it becomes a situation of hypotheticals, because if the war ended and Russia did pay reparations, then of course they would service these loans as normal, because the numbers on reparations are ginormous. I've seen a range from 130 to 210 billion being talked about for reparations on the European side, what they have claimed, and then also international courts have estimated, I've seen up to 300 billion USD. So I think the real hypotheticals come into play when we get past this sort of liminal space between C and D, as I understand it. And it's that the war ends, there's a ceasefire, the war ends, Russia refuses to pay reparations, as they have said. And so in this case, the European Union may decide to do the reparations loan, which is essentially using the Russian assets as collateral on a further loan that then, once Russia pays reparations, they would then say, okay, well, now you get the principal back. Now you get those frozen assets back. And again, like I mentioned before, the volume of that loan, I've seen it range from 130 to 210 billion. And so it's quite a large loan. In this case, that happens, the war ends, Russia refuses to pay reparations, and then they do a reparations loan, then the loans are serviced, and then that's okay. And that reparations loan element is the part that comes from outside of the ULCM legislation, because again, as I said, we were basing this off of the payment waterfall that they lay out in the legislation and adding the political factors as we understand them. So like the nightmare scenario comes when the EU doesn't do a reparations loan, or there isn't support, and that also or in the case that any support is insufficient. So in this case, yes, Ukraine would be left holding the bag, so to speak. But there are certain other conditions that I would say would ameliorate the situation, not least the fact that, if the war ends, Russia refuses to pay reparations, those assets are still going to be frozen based on the Article 122 legislation. There's very, very strict measures needed to actually unfreeze the assets in those cases. So additional factors that add to Ukraine's position here are that in the case that the war ends, Russia refuses to pay reparations, and there is no reparations loan, so to speak. First of all, European Union members themselves, they could help out. Second of all, if the war ended, or when the war ends, there would be a massive influx of capital into Ukraine. I'm aware that many, many European companies, development banks, for example, are very much seeding the ground, working on infrastructure, that they're preparing for this event to occur, so that there will be a massive influx of capital into Ukraine, and that will very much levy the situation. One last thing that we'll mention is that the European Union's 18.1 billion euro tranche, this is guaranteed by the European Union's budget headroom, which is essentially, basically the European Union has its budget, but then they have the legal ability to call on member states to contribute more. And also they can raise funds on capital markets. And so, as I said, this is an idiosyncratic model. And as Max was laying out, I think better than I, that the idiosyncrasy of the model also speaks to sort of the unprecedented nature of the situation at hand. And this also has implications for how other states could potentially do similar things with frozen assets of other states. So that is all from me. And I'm going to hand off to Maya. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Max and Jack. I really appreciate this presentation. Thank you for writing this report, doing this research. This is the kind of work that we take pride at Delphi featuring. I think this report is so comprehensive. It offers so much nuance that I think it will be sort of that reference point for a lot of people going forward, because you look at not just the financial side of things, how it works, but also the legal side of things. And for those of us mere mortals who are not economists, I found it really fascinating that you break down things like how this money can and cannot be used, and where it came from. I have a lot of questions, so I want to be careful in how I structure everything. My sort of number one question has to do with the whole reparations situation. Are you seeing the reparations language enough in a lot of the peace negotiations? The reparations language that's been put, because there have been so many different peace plans that have been put forward, not that any of them have been accepted, but how would you evaluate what you've seen, how the Ukrainians are approaching the reparations question? But also, wouldn't that number have to be constantly updated because the war is still ongoing 4 years plus? So how often are they revisiting all of that? And then my second question, and I'll just couple them to give you guys a chance to answer it maybe together, is your report goes quite a bit into how Russia has responded. Although Russia is largely isolated sort of from the global stage due to all the sanctions and everything else, it still has some leverage and some tools it can use to respond to this, because we don't need to read the details. We can just assume they're not happy about this. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how they have responded so far. But yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I'll take those first, and then Jack, obviously anything you want to add or think I missed or disagree with me on, please feel free to jump in after. On the reparations front, firstly, in terms of sort of estimating it and the like, obviously estimates vary hugely, and there can be many different ways to assign the value of war reparations at the end of a conflict. That is a whole other area of international law and sovereign precedent. But for the sort of basic minimum and easily agreed number, the World Bank in its annual and biannual reports estimates the economic damage that Russia's war has done to Ukraine. As of the most recent one, it was nearly 600 billion US dollars. When I first began researching this question, it was closer to $300 billion. That number is only going to continue to grow. Russia has broadly refused any consideration of repatriations, except for occasional trolling comments by Vladimir Putin and other senior Kremlin officials. I emphasize that I think these are trolling because they have come at times where the Trump administration has been engaging with Russia, such as during the Alaska summit last year. while European Union member states, the UK and others, are simultaneously taking efforts to debate the further use of Russia's frozen assets at that time. So I think Putin has basically said, "Oh, well, we could do something where, as part of this settlement, of the 230 billion frozen at Euroclear, money's frozen elsewhere. We'll take 100 billion and we'll create a U.S.-Russian joint investment fund with Kirill Dmitriev and Steve Witkoff on the top of it." But I don't think he is genuine about those comments, and I think that they are more intended to try to disrupt processes elsewhere with regards to the further harnessing of Russian sanctions. And those wouldn't be repatriation payments anyway if structured in the ways that he has laid out. So the Kremlin has shown no indication or willingness thereof to pay. The one other potential matter, and we can talk more about this if there are questions or interest, but as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a very active debate in the European Union right now about how to fund the next large loan for Ukraine. So this is the $90 billion that were harnessed or proposed to be used in December of last year, where the European Union was unable to agree steps at the time that would have involved further harnessing of these Russian frozen assets. One of the principles that was used to potentially justify seizing part of the assets or otherwise harnessing them is a framework in international law known as third-party countermeasures, where essentially the European Union would be acting to help enforce some of those reparations that Russia owes by seizing that. This obviously is not what was finally agreed. There was a more straightforward loan structure not secured over the Russian frozen assets by most, but not all EU member states proposed, though again, Hungary has vetoed that for now. So we will be, both we as in Jack and I in our further research, and we as in the wider Euro-Atlantic community will be returning to these questions going forward as those issues once again raise their heads. Jack, I'll turn over to you and see if there's anything else that you wanted to answer on those points.
Jack, let me just ask you to stop this.
Yeah, go for it.
See you.
Oh, just turn off the screen share, Jack, and then
turn off the screen share. All right. Sorry. Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's not letting me.
We just want to see your pretty background.
Yeah. This is where my Luddite nature comes in, where I'm like, how do I turn off the screen share? What the heck? Oy, oy, oy. Excuse me.
That's all right. We can continue if.
Well, while I figure it out, I was going to say, regarding the reparations, the only thing I wanted to note was, yes, the World Bank number is growing increasingly, and I would be surprised if the reparation sum doesn't go up in kind as well. And with regards to the reparations, that's what I was going to say basically. And then you had a question about sort of the Russian response to a certain degree. They've, and we go into this in the report, but Russia opened these accounts. Well, opened is an interesting word. Basically, after the Russian central bank assets were frozen, they implemented their own sort of freezing. So they created these things called Type C or Type S accounts. They're also known as Type S. And so these are required for companies that I believe they're sending over $1 million to any person or business or institution from an unfriendly country, from the unfriendly countries list, right? The infamous unfriendly countries list. And so this is sort of in response to, as I understand it, was in response to the Repo Act in 2024, which had frozen some Russian assets in the United States. And so it's really unclear at the moment, like how many dollars in assets there are stuck in these Type C accounts. One estimate found that there was 12 billion. A pre-war estimate came up to 288 billion. There was a Russian law firm that estimated that some 50 billion in U.S. unfriendly assets had been seized over the course of the war. But the real important thing is that it prevents you from taking your assets out of Russia without getting a sanctions waiver. You need to get a sanctions waiver from the Russian state in this case, and I believe you also need to get them from your own home nation as well. So essentially, this works for those who want to leave Russia. And the other thing, the last thing I would add about the Type C accounts is that this sort of contradictory in a sense because the fees and the taxes to pull your assets out of Russia are so high already that it sort of begs the question of like, what is really the strength of these Type C accounts? Anyway, that's what I would say on that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have some audience questions coming in. I want to remind everyone you can use the Q&A feature to send in the questions. And here we go. Jack is technologically advanced. Thank you.
Yes, all it took was a monologue. Yeah.
We have one good question. Let's start with that one first. Whilst Russian frozen assets are subject to legal due process, what about assets linked to espionage and acts of state terrorism by Russia? Can they be confiscated in a speedy manner? Let me combine that with the next one from the same person, which says Iran's acts of terrorism extend to many forms, from downing jets to running partnership with Russia. What are the ways to arrest these assets on complex company schemes and trusts, shell companies?
Sure. So I'll jump off into that, and then I'll provide a bit more context on wider aspects that are going on here. The short answer is, unsurprisingly, Russian intelligence, the GRU or the FSB, does not go and open up its own bank account in its own name, right? And the operational accounts that they use and that they set up are usually in small amounts and not in the billions and the like that would make a dent in the reparations here. There are assets that have been linked to Russian activities that in various jurisdictions across Europe have in the past been seized as a result of their use for criminal proceeds. But of course, usually when there's espionage involved, often the Kremlin tries to argues that there's plausible deniability. It doesn't come in and argue that the assets in Russian assassin X or intelligence operatives Y's are sovereign assets themselves. There are large numbers of other Russian assets held abroad, including those connected to other Russian state companies that I mentioned at the beginning. And one of those we go into a little bit in our paper because it's really relevant for some of the precedent here in terms of Russia's own legal challenges, and one of the things that has scared the European Union and other countries from acting further, which is that in 2014, an arbitration court in the Netherlands ruled that $50 billion in restitution was owed to shareholders of the former Russia's formerly largest oil company, Yukos. This is the company that was set up by a Russian oligarch named Mikhail Khodorkovsky that was seized in Putin's first years in power, 2003, 2004, and ultimately in a manner that was highly opaque and involved a lot of sleights of hand, and is the subject of much excellent research on Putin's early rule, including the support that Western actors occasionally gave for some of these actions that the Kremlin undertook. But that judgment was issued by an arbitration court in the Netherlands. And that is very important because the fundamental bit of international law that oversees the recognition of arbitral judgments, arbitration court judgments between Russia, Belgium, and the Netherlands is what is called the 1986 Belgium-Netherlands-Soviet Union Bilateral Investment Treaty. And bilateral investment treaties are standard treaties that lay out the terms of how investor state and state dispute settlements are handled, what arbitration courts go and honor them, and then how those arbitration awards can go and be enforced. The Kremlin is the signatory or the inheritor of the Soviet Union status as the signatory to this bilateral investment treaty. It formally remains in place, despite the myriad legal changes that have happened both in Russia and the Soviet Union's own sovereign framework, as well as under the EU frameworks that have taken place in legal developments in Belgium and the Netherlands. Since then, that award has been in place for more than 12 years, and the claimants of that award have almost entirely been able to unenforce it against the Russian sovereign, or even against Rosneft, the Russian state oil company that essentially ended up with almost all of Yukos assets after that process. The reasons why are: one, Russia says it will honor foreign arbitrary awards, but in practice does not. And two, because the actual process of adjudicating who should pay a claim in that case against the Russian sovereign or against Russian state oil companies is very difficult. There's lots of precedent from this from Venezuela, in fact, where there was action taken by certain creditors that engaged in what was called piercing the veil. That meant that they had a claim against the Venezuelan state oil company and were able to prove that before a U.S. court that Venezuelan state oil company was in effect the state and that there was no legal difference. They submitted briefs to the court showing things like the Venezuelan state oil company, PDVSA, doing an advertising program that said PDVSA is the state of Venezuela. So, that was pretty helpful to them. But Russia's lawyers and the like have obviously long argued that isn't before. The fear that some European Union policymakers and legal scholars have had is that if there is further moves, whether it be under the third-party countermeasures principles that I laid out earlier or other structures used to potentially harness these Russian frozen assets, that Russia would then be able to get an arbitration court judgment in its favor under that bilateral investment treaty, and then second, that it would be able to enforce it. I think the fact that Russia is effectively not enforcing its own judgments on there doesn't mean that the European Union and others should go and say we're going to stoop to their level necessarily, but does give enough precedent for a court to go and say Russia is a political, not a business actor to these claims, and is not acting in good faith. I have a very hard time imagining a European or Belgian or other judge finding Russia to be acting in good faith when it is so obvious how much it does not in these cases. But that bilateral investment treaty and those legal precedents from others are very important. The last point I'll just mention to return to the original questions is, yes, there are legal frameworks, particularly in the United States, about the seizing of sovereign assets and lawsuits related to them over support for acts of terrorism. Those have been used by victims of terrorism to litigate against Hezbollah, Iran, and others. There's even a long-running, it is quite literally 25 years now since the attacks of September 11th, where some litigants have tried to argue that Saudi Arabia should have some liability for that. This is something that Congress has subsequently come under a lot of pressure to change the legal frameworks on as well. In European law and in British law, with the caveat that I'm not a lawyer, I'm not aware of as extensive similar precedent. It may be that it is out there, but even in those cases, it can be very difficult to prove, and it is not what I would say is going to be the most likely way to hold Russia to account, and rather further financial engineering done wisely, as in the case of the ERA loan and the Ukraine loan cooperation mechanism. That is where we are likely to be more able to hold Russia to account to the damage that it has done to Ukraine.
Great. Bob, while you have somewhat of a peaceful moment, no sirens, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. I was, so I guess the fundamental question I have is this repeatable? whether the war continues or not. But if, let's say, the war continues, presumably these Russian assets will remain frozen, will continue to draw in earn interest. Or if the war ends and Russia refuses to pay reparations, the assets would remain frozen and would continue to earn interest. Then could new loans then be issued to Ukraine in that interest, secure those new loans?
So the shortest possible answer that I can give, and Jack may have other thoughts after, is yes, they can be. The rate at which that this will be repaid, and like depends on finance concept known as the time value of money, which obviously relates to the baseline interest rates that have to pay. Those interest rates are changing right now as we speak. Just today alone, for example, the UK yield curve, which basically what investors are saying they expect the Bank of England here to do in response to potential inflationary pressures out of the war of Iran, went up to 75 basis points, 3 separate increases this year, right? Those outlooks will change tremendously, and those will affect the speed at which money is earned off of these frozen assets, and then the speed at which the underlying original loans are repaid. The reason for those very long timelines on the repayment for the initial loans that Jack laid out is essentially to say, even if interest rates were to go to like 0%, right? Still, by investing in highly liquid government securities, you would have more than ample time for the assets remaining frozen to repay the principal of the $50 billion owed here. What I would say is, leaving all of that aside and assuming that but if one were to say that there had been no change to the time value of money since these loans were issued in the beginning of last year, that for other very large loans to Ukraine, things that are in the tens of billions plus, such as the $90 billion loan that was suggested last year, you will have to get into structures that involve either reinvesting Russian assets at a much higher rate, therefore in riskier securities, or in efforts to engage in things like those third-party countermeasures that I outlined earlier. The last thing I'll say is I have published a separate paper in short form in an article at the Financial Times nearly 2 years ago now, that laid out another structure that I thought would be useful to consider in doing this. The reason why I did it was more, this proposal, to be clear, is more based on the idea of showing that there are many tricky ways that you could restructure the Russian assets to benefit Ukraine, and that we shouldn't be tied to the shibboleths of doing so in the most safe and secure way possible, because we're talking about extremely high stakes here, including the future of not only Ukraine, but Europe's defense. So in that proposal, I had said, well, you could direct the frozen Russian funds to be invested in Ukrainian war bonds that pay out when Russia launches missiles at Ukraine. So this is combining, Ukraine has an existing war bond structure, and they're called catastrophe bonds, best known as used, for example, to pay as a form of insurance for hurricanes. So the catastrophe bonds continue to pay coupon all throughout, and the principal only gets wiped out if there's a very large hurricane. The structure is basically said the same for Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukraine, that these money goes into these Ukrainian bonds. The Ukrainians then owe a form of interest on them, but that interest in the principal gets negged every time Russia launches a missile at it. That, I said, this will disincentivize the Kremlin to continue the war if it really does want its frozen assets back, because every time that they shoot a missile at Ukraine, they will effectively be transferring money from their frozen account at Euroclear to the Ukrainians' account. Now, I take no qualms over whether the Europeans or anybody else doesn't like that proposal. I think it is more an example just to show of how further financial engineering can be done, and we have to be creative in these cases. But in theory, there's no reason, in my view, and obviously there will be others, including international lawyers, who are more skeptical of this. But in my view, there should be no reason why we can't find ways to harness the entire 230 billion in principal of Russian assets at Euroclear, as well as the 70 billion plus in Russian frozen assets elsewhere, whether that be done under a structure like the one I just outlined or a third party enforcement of Russian reparations. I think the level of crisis calls for breaking longstanding shibboleths about how we act in these scenarios. And certainly, I can tell you, if the shoe is on the other foot, such as when it comes to Western assets that are frozen within Russia, which Jack was talking about earlier, the Kremlin is very creative in finding ways to harness them, seize them, tax them to the nth degree. And, so why should we counter that with one arm tied behind our backs?
Jack, did you want to comment on this question as well?
I don't have anything to add, truthfully, beyond just that the legislation lays out that other countries that host the frozen assets, we know from research that France, Luxembourg, possibly Singapore, they have frozen Russian assets that they can contribute to the basket ULCM. So that's an added benefit. But yes, just to echo what Max said, also to answer your question, the answer is yes, right? This structure can continue.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, I mean, that's the simplest way, right, is to take other frozen assets in the UK, US, and elsewhere and put them into the ULCM. That could be done. That would be, I'm not saying these are accurate numbers, but let's say there's 7 billion frozen in the UK and 3 billion in Luxembourg. Those could be added there and then used to support this. But when it comes to structures like the potential for another 90 billion, as was debated in December, I think you need to get into the principle of the Russian frozen assets.
Yeah, and just kind of doing the math according to sort of the latest numbers that you gave us, Max, the damage estimate is around 600 billion. You said 200 billion is frozen and then another 70. There's a lot of money missing here. And then the right, even the principal is not enough from what's frozen. And then again, the war goes on. So this reparations question is so important, and it should constantly be at the top of the discussion agendas, I think. And these numbers should always be updated and be at the top of our minds. But as one of our guests asks, even the very concept of these reparations being granted is now in question, right? Because so much of it is a political decision in a way. So the question here is, are you concerned about the Trump administration and Hungary's alignment and, concerning the reparations loans to Ukraine? Or I guess we could add to that just the political will and support in Ukraine. 4 years on, we keep hearing, these terms, war fatigue. So what's your assessment of the environment? How favorable is the environment to sort of supporting reparations for Ukraine going forward?
I think within the European Union, there still is a lot of support, right? And for example, while Hungary and Italy were opposed in December, Germany, which has long had some of the most conservative ideas with regards to not being willing to engage in debt financing structures, right? Whether that be in Greece or in Germany's own borrowing. Over the years, Germany has broken with its past there. I think we shouldn't get too tied up in the day-to-day of things. Hungary has elections coming up in a month. Putin is sending oil to Cuba that's due to arrive on Monday. Trump might get very mad about that. Russia has obviously been reported in the Wall Street Journal and other credible places to be supplying Iranian forces with intelligence to target U.S. troops, right? And Trump does often vacillate on these things. There were even comments from the Trump administration in the beginning of last year where they said, oh, sure, let's just seize the Russian frozen assets in the U.S. too, which are much smaller. But, I have myself written articles advocating for Washington to do that. And there is legal frameworks in U.S. law that aren't relevant to this exact paper here. But I have an article out for Foreign Policy in January last year where I called on the Biden administration to engage in some of that action. I think we need to continue to research and plan and look at these questions from the scope of what is possible and what is misunderstood about the risks to them. Because if we just sort of say no, it's impossible, then you're kind of giving up already. I think if you had asked a random European country policymaker A or random European country policymaker B, if they would have thought that this kind of structure would be possible at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they would have said no. We do see real progress there, and we hope to continue to see more, if only because it gives us lots more to write about.
We have another question that asks, since when isn't GRU an agency of the Russian state? Why would it be immune from seizure and forfeiture? I actually missed.
I think this is in response to my. So, of course, the GRU is an agency of the Russian state. What I mean is, like, the GRU doesn't, the GRU doesn't go and open a bank account at Barclays Bank in London or Chase Manhattan Bank in the U.S. that says this is an account in the name of the GRU, right? They create a false identity for somebody under some kind of cover, whether that be deep cover or diplomatic cover. In which case they then put the assets in that individual's name. There are assets held in the names of embassies and the like, some of which may be used for intelligence activity. I'm not an intelligence researcher, but I'm sure I've read examples of that in the past. I recall them, but there are separate carve-outs and sort of sanctions authorities that say that embassies can still use certain funds for their day-to-day operations, right? But like, even if you take the fact that the GRU is obviously a very serious, very large, and very favored arm of the Kremlin, if you think about it, like, it's a subsidiary. If you use sort of the corporate analogy, this is the Russian sovereign money. This is the parent company's money, right? All the money from the GRU, from Rosneft, from taxes, others ultimately flows up to the Russian sovereign, and this is that money that the Russian sovereign then had in the international financial system, rather than sitting in gold bars at home or invested in Russian domestic assets.
Thank you, Max. Let me turn the last question over to you, Jack. What monitoring is in place in the EU to detect attempts to move or disguise assets to circumvent freezes, like using different jurisdictions or cryptocurrency, etc.?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I would say, beyond the regular sanctions structures that exist, I would actually defer this question to Max because he's much more the sanctions expert on this. But I would also say, this is a really good question. And since we're planning to write a second paper on this very issue, that is an angle that we're definitely going to be exploring more. So thank you for informing our research.
So yes, thank you for the question. Crypto and a lot of these other structures exist to try to keep money out of the normal financial plumbing, right? So to try to keep it away from institutions like Euroclear or the banks that have relationships there. The Kremlin has engaged in a lot of lawfare against Euroclear included, and it's domestically in Russia over other frozen assets that are there. The biggest problem I think that we have right now in terms of all of this is that sanctions authorities in places like the UK and France and elsewhere have estimated the amount of Russian sovereign assets that they have, but they have not detailed where all of those assets are invested, or in the case of comparing to Euroclear, what's called custodied, right? So we know about the very large amount in Euroclear from the beginning because Euroclear disclosed it, and because Euroclear was the obvious place to look. It is the clearinghouse, to use the analogy common in the political science around this. It is the core node in the plumbing of the financial system of investing in securities in Europe. So it's the sort of if again, I'm not saying that this is likely. Anyway, I'm choosing somewhere random out of a hat. If Guatemala or Indonesia were sanctioned in the same way too, right? Euroclear would be the first place that you would look for where their assets, the sovereign assets, were as well. If I could make one request to policymakers for ensuring that we're aware of exactly the full size of Russian assets and how they can best be harnessed, it would be for them to do a better job of disclosing the Russian frozen assets, the Russian assets frozen elsewhere, including at UK financial institutions, Luxembourgish financial institutions, French ones, et cetera, et cetera.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we'll have to end the conversation here. But again, I'd like to remind our audience members that the report is available on our website at the moment, so you can check it out, and keep an eye on our website and on our emails, because there will be a lot more analysis coming from Max and Jack and many of our scholars. Max Hess, Jack Strasser, Bob Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our audience members for tuning in. Have a great day.
Thank you, Maya.
Thanks
Thank you,
so
everybody, for
much.
joining.
Thank you, Maya.